finding the present. The present moment began with fire, and still it burns. It began with water, and still they drown on the margins of Europe. It began with air. See how they flee. See how the bombs fall on houses made of sand, dreams made of flesh, the blind drones of remote war. But then it began with earth, where all destinies are one, but many perish for want of justice, or soap, or flowers instead of fears. Our age is confused. The essence of our world right now is transitioning. We're moving from one thing slowly into another. The new thing that we're moving into is, I feel, possibly quite dangerous for humanity, for most people on this planet. And this is a time when language has to join, has to help to create, for want of a better phrase, a new army of light, a new army of rebalancing, a new army of truth. Because what we need right now more than anything else is truth. We've had plenty of fake news. We've had plenty of alternative facts. This is a time for new truth. Coda. In the oldest legends of the land, it is known that all are born in prison. In the new reality, all are born into a story. It is a story which everyone creates and which everyone lives, with darkness or with light, in freedom. The awakening that I referred to in my new novel, The Freedom Artist. You see, that's why literature and language are so important, because they are intimately related to consciousness. And literature, at its most powerful, helps to shift the axis of an age for the very simple reason that it shifts the axis of our consciousness, of each person that reads it. If you can imagine reading Crime and Punishment around the time that it was published, or reading Don Quixote around the time it was published, to read it for the first time. There are books, and there are many other books like that. The Outsider by Camus, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. These are books that when you read them, you begin in one kind of consciousness and one kind of state of mind, and by the time you've finished, you're in another. You're subtly changed, enriched. That's what literature, that's one of the most powerful things that literature does. It's not rhetoric. It's not trying to persuade you into something that you're not. It's adjusting your mental lens so that you see the world in a new way, clearly, for the first time.
In this book, you describe the world as a prison, and a prison that has been built for generations and generations, and you describe the hierarchy in essence as ourself. The people discover that they are the hierarchy. So would you say that they live in a false consciousness, and the way to kind of wakening this up can be words, can be literature?
Well, living in a false consciousness, living in a slightly darkened consciousness, is in many ways the long story of humanity. We go through ages when we have a new orientation about how the world can be. There are mental revolutions, there are social revolutions, there are cultural revolutions. And by revolutions, I don't mean the overturning of society. I just simply mean the turning over of the mind, so that we see what we're capable of being anew. we're harbourers of prisons. We really are. We harbour prisons of ideas about how society can be. We harbour prisons of ideas about what we are as human beings, gender prisons, race prisons, tribal prisons, all kinds of prisons we have inside our heads and our consciousness. And we need to be progressively freed from many of them to be able to realize our potential as human beings and as citizens in a society to the fullest. So not only literature, art can do it, dance can do it, politics is eminently, when it's most enlightened, in a powerful way to do it. Politics because of deeds and laws, literature, dance, music, art, because of how it affects our consciousness, because of how it makes us aware of how much freer we can be, and how, in a way, we are primarily, each individual, the co-creators of our world. We really are. Literature at its best empowers that, strengthens that. Yeah. The prison was the single greatest structure in the world, and it cast an enormous shadow. It was made of lead, concrete, iron, adamant, volcanic rock, stout steel, and organic substances of unusually tough material. It was the forbidden masterwork of the hierarchy. It was the work of innumerable generations. It was believed to have been built at the beginning of time, and it was referred to in this way in the new myths. Successive eras of evolution, technology, philosophy, and intentionality had gone into its aggregate construction. Its foundations went deep into the earth. It was like a gigantic mausoleum. The prison had 3 levels. Outwardly, it was shaped like a pyramid, but with 5 sides instead of 4. Each side, made of the toughest material, had a single window. The window was always darkened. It was a compact mass of darkness and force, so tall it blotted out the sky. The whole area around it was a dead zone. The prison was the heart of the land, its greatest symbol. It was the land. Though no one had ever seen the prison before because of the force field around it that had rendered it invisible, all roads and all destinies led to the prison. Well, if I'm really honest, literature was always a kind of unconscious part of my upbringing. Books were always there. I didn't primarily want to be a writer when I was a child. I wanted to be a scientist, I wanted to be a composer, I wanted to be a painter. To be a writer came quite low on my list, actually. It wasn't even there in a way. But a series of crucial things that happened in my life, the intersection of history and me, I think began to change all that. And for me, if I was going to sort of start to mention the changes, I would say coming back from England to Africa when I was a child was a real extraordinary awakening for me. Because it made me aware, in reverse, that no culture has an absolute view on looking at the world. My love of language was planted in me, in my father, who was a lawyer, spoke beautifully and loved Latin. My mother, who was a great storyteller, an enigmatic storyteller. But also at school, I loved literature. Without knowing that it was literature, I just loved what it did, the sounds, the images. History and its impact on me, the Nigerian Civil War. I was a child when it broke and erupted right in the middle of my family. And as a young child still, I saw death, I saw people being shot. I saw neighbors, good people, suddenly becoming, manipulated by the ethos of the times and changing overnight. But above all, I saw death, and that to see death at 8 is a real awakener, because you're aware from very early on of the strange, apparent finality of life. And I began to ask questions, and those questions began to sound like thunder in my spirit. Social questions, political questions, questions of the individual and reality. That's where it started. Poverty afterwards, some homelessness afterwards. They just deepened. And one day I was painting, and one day I just thought I should write about rainfall. It was raining outside. It's a long story, I'll make it short. But I made an astonishing discovery, which is that when I wrote, I disappeared. Ben Okri vanished. I just went straight into this thing called writing. I was in that place. And then I came back out and the poem was written, and I thought, wow, that has to be the most miraculous entry into another state of consciousness that I've experienced outside of any spiritual practice.
I have the feeling that you might have a broader understanding of literature than we know it in the Western world. Kind of, we have very much our tales and books and so. But in Nigeria, maybe in many parts of Africa, you have also this oral tradition of storytelling. You have the real world, you have the more kind of spiritual world. So there are many layers coming together, and you find that in your books as well. How would you describe for me how this kind of multi-layered ways of telling stories, living stories, has formed your view on literature, and how is that translated into your authorship?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Because when I was learning to write, I read the books that were available in my father's library that he brought with him from England. And so I read all the classics as we know them. But when I began to write, I became aware slowly over a period of time, it wasn't immediate, that there was a real gap between the world as it was described by many of the books I'd read and my African reality that I grew up with, which is a reality that involves the reality of storytelling, of myth, the realm of the ancestors, the realm of the gods, the realm of the unborn, and this so-called everyday quotidian reality. And one lived and experienced all of these different realities at the same time. It's very, very important that I stress that. Of course, this multi-layered experiencing of reality is slowly fading because of the impact of, you can call it globalization, or you can call it the modern contemporary universal reality, or worldwide rather than universal reality. But it's still there. And so when I came to write, after my second novel, I became so aware of this gap between the world rendered by people like Jane Austen and Dickens, great and wonderful writers who they are, and this African reality with all its levels. And I thought, I've got to find it. I felt it was impossible to go on without finding a new way to write that will capture all of these levels of reality that I'd grown up with and that were natural to many people's way of looking at the world, to capture all those levels of reality at the same time. Not to write and talk about one reality, describe it, and then another reality, which will lead to a very swollen and indigestible text. Because actually when we experience the reality, we experience it all at once, if you know what I mean. So I spent years just trying to find a new tone which will have all of these realities in suggested ways at once. And that was maybe one of the biggest literary experiments, and it was a great laboratory I had to go into of just going back to language and taking it apart and seeing how. And after that, my writing then became this constant question of investigating what reality actually really is, and how much of it is inflected by our consciousness. And that then led me to how we affect reality, and then that led me to where I am now in the Freedom Artist, looking at how figures of power alter our reality by altering our myths, by altering our beliefs, by altering our sense of our history. And so they bend our reality and literally change who we are and what we can accept, and thereby create a new kind of very dangerous normalization. But it really begins with operating on how we experience reality through myth and through stories. So it's very important that the storyteller analyzes in stories just how this process of the manipulation of humanity is being done right now, as it was done in the 30s and 40s. They had poured towards the prison. They had crowded towards it in rage. They had wanted to destroy it, to tear it down. But as they gazed upon its monumental structure, they were struck dumb. It was the wonder of the ages, the single greatest achievement of the race. They found themselves gazing at that which had been built by their desires, their fears, their hopes, their blood, their dreams. Their ancestors had built it brick by brick, stone upon stone, metal upon metal, not knowing what it was they were building. They had built it and consecrated it with their daily lives. They thought they were building the noblest work known to man and woman for the glorification of the ages. Many millions had perished in its construction. The sea, the earth, the air, and the remote stars had collaborated in the erection of this monstrous structure that stood like a mountain on the flat earth. While they gazed upon it, the multitudes realized they were gazing upon something else, something that made them silent. They gazed almost without breathing. Each person became aware that they carried around within them the prison that they gazed upon. Each person was aware of being in prison themselves. Each person sensed now the forgotten passages from the original myth, which said that after the fall, in the beginning, was the prison. I wouldn't say that people in the West are narrow in their perception of reality. What I would say is that the West, because of its success in the manipulation of the material world, the evident success of the making of cars and aeroplanes and houses and stuff like that, then proceeds to assume that the way it perceives reality is the universal and the only way to perceive it. That is its narrowness. The assumption that this way of looking at the world, that things are only what you can see and touch, only, which is tremendously powerful because it has given rise to this incredible rationalism that's enabled the manipulation and the shaping and the creating of new kinds of things, as it were. But that way of insisting that the things that you can see and touch are the only realities, that's the mistake, because there are other realities, there are other people's realities, in different parts of the world. And their realities include the things that you can see and touch, and also the things that you don't see and touch. Invisible things, presences, thoughts, the dead, the unborn. This may or may not be true, but science at this moment does not have the equipment to prove that it's not true. And so reality as we perceive it really finally is reality as we can perceive it through our consciousness, which is to say through our beliefs. To insist on one belief system as being the only way of seeing the universe is not only narrow, it's a kind of mental, cultural and spiritual tyranny, which has incredible implications for storytelling and for our relationships with one another, and for our relationships with nature, our relationships with the environment. Because it means that we're constantly waiting for the evidence of the destruction that we have done before we believe that we have done any destruction. But by then, it is too late. So we need a new kind of understanding of reality to understand how we affect it negatively and positively. In short, what I'm trying to say is that we need a wider worldview. We need one that includes what we know to be true and what works for us, but one that also includes what other people know to be true and that works for them, and to respect that, and to be open to that in terms of the broad possibilities of what it is to be human. That's where literature is very powerful. You have an old oral storytelling tradition of Africa and India and the Middle East that suggests new ways, richer ways of looking at the world. We need that desperately, because this narrowness, this very limited way of saying what reality is slowly killing us. I'll give you one very simple example of the Europeans who came to Africa and brought with them this very specific idea of farming, that you cut down all the trees. You cut down all the trees in order to farm. We've since discovered that actually that was the worst thing you can do. You could actually do the farming without having to destroy the trees. The two things can coexist. But you need a new relationship with reality, a new relationship with nature, a new respect of nature, the visible and the invisible part of nature, in order to begin to see this. Just a small example.
You mentioned that nobody and no culture has this universal truth, which of course only people can believe that only know one culture and never travel or meet different cultures. I was thinking in your novel kind of the mountain plays quite an important role. You go up there, you're part of the society, but you go up and you get a viewpoint that gives you some kind of overview. And then I was trying to connect that a little bit to your biography because, and I might be wrong, but you have grown up with two worlds at least, Nigeria and London. And maybe this has led to an observation of the world that you see the one in the mirror of the other, and maybe you don't feel part of one culture. I mean, in Nigeria, you might have been seen as the one from Great Britain with a privileged father. And in London, you might have been seen as somebody from Africa in this generalization, a black person in a white culture. Would you say that this upbringing between two worlds have given you something that can be compared with kind of the observable perspective of that mountain, that you are part of those societies, but you are able to see them from a distance?
Yeah, I'm surprised you think that I've lived only between two worlds. I would say I've lived between at least 5 worlds. Nigeria, Africa, which is a constant part of my sensibility and my worldview. Europe, which is where I've lived these many years and written and thought. But there's also the world of books. And that's a world. That's a constant world. It's a fluid world. It's a rich world. It's a world as powerful in its influence on me as this living world. In fact, I probably spend more time in that world than in any other. Then there's a world of dreams. Then there's a world of conversations with people from all cultures, constant conversations. And then there's a world, for want of a better phrase, the slowly swirling, unifying world that we're all part of. So I don't think it's really so distinct as just Africa and Europe. Because even in Africa you're reading, so the literary world is available to you. In the African world, Europe has made an important invasion into its sensibility. But even in Europe, Africa is there. But I understand what you're trying to say about not being entirely part of one or the other gives you a third space. But I think that third space is available to anybody of sensibility, anybody who has a deep hunger for new possibilities of their art or their spirit. Absolutely. You have writers like Chinua Achebe who attained the level of world-class art growing up in Nigeria, listening to the stories of the land, reading the stories of the world. We can ascend mountaintops in all kinds of ways. But there's an extraordinary synthesis that happens when you have two cultures, or two realms, two worlds. It's a synthesis, and at the same time, it's I think maybe the most valuable thing is the way in which it suddenly makes you suspicious of any over-determining worldview. The idea that these people here, that there's a way of looking at the world that these people have, and that's it. When you're between, you're like, no, there isn't just one way. There's so many ways, and none of them are true, and all of them are true. And that's wonderful, to be kind of slightly liberated from, a little bit, from the prison of culture. Cultures are both prisons and liberations at the same time. With the first star of dawn, an amazing thing came to pass. With no turning of the keys in the locks, the gates of the prison opened and the doors were unbolted. The boy, no longer the boy warrior, was seen coming out of the prison. He looked tiny beneath those gigantic gates. The massive skeleton with the scythe suddenly looked harmless. They had expected a hero, but they saw a child. They saw a child who had once been read to by an old man. A child who had been read to from the original myth. He came out of the prison with a playful smile on his face. He smiled as though the world was a child's game played in eternity. As the multitudes beheld him, they sensed the wheels of fortune change. The child seemed to them the very image of the world as it should be. What should I say? What will I say to the young generation right now? I will say to the young generation that we, the human race right now, are in an absolutely decisive moment of human history. We are on the edge of a cliff. And what is over that cliff, and how deep that is, whether there's any recovery from the fall, nobody knows. I would say that it's quite possible that actually we've already gone over the edge and that we're living right now in the memory of our pre-fall. We're falling, but we don't know it. I would say that we are in great danger as a species. And unfortunately, you are the one who's inheriting it. A huge awakening needs to take place. Fast. An accelerated awakening has to take place. And an accelerated reaction and compensation in terms of our environment, in terms of our climate, in terms of where we are as a species. It might be too late, but we have to. I think the time for sleepwalking is over. I think the time for assuming that time will just go on normally is over. I don't know how one can send the fire of a new awakening of how serious the situation is right now in the world, and that citizens all over the world should wake up and seize the responsibility of their citizenship, and to go out into the streets, whatever form there is, of saying this has to stop. We have to reverse the damage we're doing to ourselves. A new world thinking is needed. A new world thinking is needed. No longer Europe, American. That's part of the problem. A new world thinking is needed. We have to look at the whole world right now as one country, one place, whose collective destiny is in great danger. So we need a new world thinking on immigration, a new world thinking on the economies. What does it mean, all these different economies, one benefiting, the other becoming poorer? What the hell is all of that? What's wrong with us human beings? You know, we're on this one planet together. How can we live, go to sleep, wake up, knowing that people just like us are dying for simple things like soap or food? It's ridiculous. There's enough to go around for the whole planet. We need a new world thinking. In literature, in art, in politics, in culture, in our relationships with one another. We need to tear down walls. We're complaining about the wall that gentleman is trying to build out in America. But we've got all kinds of walls between us, all kinds of walls between us as people and cultures and nations. It's ridiculous. This world can be miraculous and manageable for everybody.
But in order to do that, to shape this we should overcome our divides, as you say, of race, of countries, of gender. Who can be the translator? Can it be a poem that you started with? Because it needs something to overcome those divides.
Yes, but I resist asking for one figure, one hero figure to come along and do it and do it for everybody. I think that's a very old and dangerous thinking. Anyway, I think that kind of thinking, that kind of mythic hero thinking worked when you were dealing with groups, small groups. That worked then. Now everybody needs to be the hero. We need to scatter the idea of heroism and awaken it in everybody, all human beings. Because if we don't all wake up to what it means to stand up and express our voice in a positive way, if we don't all do it, nothing is going to happen. If we're waiting for one person to do it, that's way too dangerous. Because first of all, you know, there are too many forces that can work against and distort what this one person is trying to say. There are too many forces that can undermine it. We need to get into a place where all the forces can't undermine. We need to go beyond what can be undermined. So it needs to be everybody. It needs to be the world. We need to all wake up. We need to just, yeah. You can feel my passion. We are all on a great ship that has lost its balance, lost its way. And a huge storm is gathering beyond the iron veil of our hearts. Maybe it is a storm of revelation. Maybe it is a storm of truth.